Everyone, good morning. So, great to see you all here. It's literally what you've all been waiting for, and that's the output of the Standards, Norms and Best Practice Working Group. So, the names of everyone on the group are listed here. It was a really terrific group to be part of. And we also had some great input from some of the visitors that we had from other workshops that wanted to input as well. We were building on the work that was done last year from the What is Open group. And we were really lucky that Martin was on that group last year and continued on our working group this year to provide that continuity. Many members of the group are here today. They're kind of hiding at the back, along with many of other people. Everyone seems to be at the back and not at the front. Obviously, they can contribute to the presentation if I miss anything important out. So in terms of building on the work from last year, the What is Open group defined the kind of dimensions of openness. Any research output or research object can be defined across a spectrum of openness, and the four dimensions are that it is discoverable, accessible, reusable, and transparent. And as I said, it is a spectrum, though. That's the kind of framework we were thinking about. So it could move from being quite closed to a more open research output or research object. The remit of the group was quite broad, and that's in your booklets. And the way that we looked at it, our goal for the workshop was to aim at quite an idealised goal and apply these DART principles to across the entire research spectrum. So not just talking about the published outputs of research, but really across the whole of scholarship. This is the Open Scholarship Initiative, and we felt that that was an appropriate thing to do. So applying DART, the DART principles, inform the standards that different stakeholders use? Could it inform the norms and the best practices? And these standards, norms and best practices, we felt it was very important, would be created by the various stakeholders within the research or the scholarly environment. And we defined those stakeholders as researchers, as their universities, as their libraries, as their funders, as their scholarly societies, and as their publishers. And if we applied DART principles or this spectrum of openness, to what degree would any standard that's being used by those stakeholders or the norms or the best practices, what degree would those increase openness? And how effective of any of those standards, norms and best practices would be in terms of improving scholarship? And we felt that that was very important. It's very important to understand why are we doing all of this, because there will be costs to it. And for example, that could be around increasing the reproducibility of research in terms of sharing data, increasing innovation within research, again, in open data. It could be around increasing the efficiency. So research is not repeated because negative results are not disseminated. But we did feel it was important to understand and measure what the results of a more open environment would be. We also felt it was very important that it was sustainable, again, because there would be a significant cost involved. And the last part of evaluation would be around the compliance and adoption of the new standards. So we started working with a framework, which is here, and I don't expect, this is very much a draft, and we're looking forward to getting your advice and input into it. But we started working with a matrix. This is the standards one, where across the top, we've got our 5 major stakeholders in the process, and down the bottom, if if you can see, hope you can see that. We've split the research life cycle into 5 main areas: ideas generation, knowledge creation, so the doing of the work, of the research, the interpretation and analysis of that work, the dissemination of it, and also the evaluation of the research. And then we started to populate that matrix and those cells, sometimes with well-known and very well-used standards. For example, publishers have many tools available to aid discoverability, for example, the DOI. In some, it was more to do with emerging standards, and in some places, it's a gap analysis, and there may not be standards available. However, I would stress, as this is a work in progress, some of those gaps are because not all of the standards have been filled in before. For example, on knowledge creation, some researchers have very well-defined standards about how they conduct their experiments and their research. In some places, for example, in some gaps, that's completely fine. You wouldn't necessarily expect publishers to be setting standards of how researchers conduct their experimental design and work. You may expect publishers to help the adoption of some of those standards, but the creation of those standards would come from the community who is doing that research. We had visitors from other groups who spoke about the potential need, and we heard this through the impact factor group, the need for more standards and metrics for research evaluation. So that may be something, although there are many groups looking at that, that might be something that needs to evolve further. We then started looking at norms, and this was what would need to change from the environment we're in now to what norms would need to change from the environment we're in now to encourage a more open scholarship environment. For example, it could be around funders recognising data sharing and citation and incentivising and rewarding that. And then we looked at what best practices would need to start to be embedded again in this move towards a more open environment. For example, and much of this is around the incentivisation towards sharing and more open research. The kind of DART principles, the incentivisation of the DART principles being applied to a scholarly environment. And as I said, this is not supposed to be an exhaustive, it's just how we started to populate within the group this matrix. We then also spoke about barriers and also some considerations around cost of implementation as well. So barriers, perceived barriers, well, real barriers would be lack of time or energy to adopt new processes. Change takes work and culture change is very difficult. There is a perception that for many researchers and scholars within the system that the current system serves many of their needs relatively well as individuals. Also cost of implementation, and this is something that was also brought up by visitors from the Global South group, and we heard considerations of that as well. The adoption of standards can be a costly process. Concerns about scholars and various communities of scholars have concerns about paying to publish. Again, that echoes some of the feedback that we had yesterday. Impact measures and concerns around prestige. Concerns about the speed of delivery. I think there is an argument that said this could be quite burdensome, and actually the speed of publication could be slowed down. Some communities and some scholars have some concerns around being able to control what happens to their work after publication. Fear of scooping in terms of more open environment of sharing data and results, and the potential to desire to maximise particular research groups or the people that originated the data to maximise the research output from that data. In terms of sort of next steps and evaluation and improvement, as I said, we're looking for your feedback and your expertise and advice about how to take this forward. After identifying any, as I said, kind of real gaps within that gap analysis, proposing potential standards, norms and best practices, and creating an evaluation scheme for future sort of relevance and improvement. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and turning up so early. Thank the rest of the group as well, and happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. The other thing that I meant to mention and didn't, but again, I think it's a good point. We were, as I said, we were a great group, of course, but we were very conscious that there were no funders or researchers or university administrators within our group at all. So this is, as I said, it's very much a starting place.
I was really curious about how you addressed, or how, standing here right now, impromptu, you would address the charge of slowing down the research process. I'm concerned about that because in many OECD countries, we were facing a decline in support for research, or at least for higher education and other sources. Britain, for example, is likely to re-elect May, who will then push more austerity, which is not exactly going to lead to more funding for research. The United States are facing a similar decline. It seems like one objection from faculty to DART would be, well, that's going to take more time and we have less money.
I think that's a real barrier in terms of, as you say, less people are very time poor. I think as individuals, and I can only speak from certain aspects, I work with chemists, that's what I do, but in terms of many of the chemists that I speak to, as individuals, much of the system serves them quite well. In terms of greater ideals, in terms of innovation and more effective and efficient research, they kind of get that argument. But if it then comes back to them with less money and no time, how do we get over that? And I guess that's around that incentivization as well. It goes back to how the potential reward systems, incentivization for adoption of that sort of behavior. But I agree. I think that's a very significant barrier. Yes.
So I really like that innovation in presentation.
Thank you. That was Adrian's matrix. I don't think Adrian's here. Okay. Thank you very much.
So my name's Barrett Matthews. I'm with George Washington University, and I was in the Culture of Communication work group, who are seated nearby. So if something goes wrong, they can rescue me. So to get us started, why are we here? Because there is a need for improvement. And there were two quotes that really resonated with us when we were thinking about this idea of the culture of communication. Nobody is surprised when cultural inertia slows the adoption of radical ideas. But cultural inertia slowed the adoption of OA by leading many people to mistake it for a more radical idea than it actually is. And my honest belief from experience in the trenches is that the largest obstacle to OA is misunderstanding. And so perhaps the theme, the connection between these two quotes is misunderstanding. And what causes misunderstanding? Poor communication. And so that's what we endeavored to improve. The resulting culture in an atmosphere of misunderstanding is tension, misunderstanding itself, interdisciplinary differences in experience, and focused on preserving the status quo. So how do we change the culture? Well, first, we need to clarify the message. And we think that there's a few different steps to clarifying the message. First, we ourselves need to better understand what the message is, and that's kind of figuring out what OA is and is not. So what open access is, it is an outcome and nothing more. What it's not is a peer review model, a funding model, a constriction on author rights, or a prioritizing of certain disciplines. And these issues maybe sometimes get wrapped up in the discussion around OA and sometimes conflated with OA, but they're really ancillary. OA is just an outcome, right? What is it? It's unfettered access to essential advanced knowledge, what we need to propel society and culture forward. It's for the public good, and it's for democratization. It's about including the global South. It's about professional impact for stakeholders. It's about making us all giants. So it's not a restriction, as it's sometimes viewed, but it's meant to empower. Oh boy. Oh. I guess it just had trouble with our beautiful image. So, kind of our idea, and if any of you have seen the movie Inception, this is kind of where this idea was incepted, is that you need the simplest form of an idea for it to stick with somebody. And so we want to stick to the simplest form of OA when we're communicating. And then when we communicate out to different groups and different stakeholders, it's important that we tailor the message to each group. So when we talk about OA, we shouldn't talk about OA in the same way to a provost that we would to a humanities studies or a humanities scholar. We shouldn't talk about it in the same way to a humanities scholar that we would a student or to a STEM researcher. Because each of them have a different experience and they have different priorities. And so OA is going to mean something a little bit different to each of them. But the core, what OA is always the same: open, unfettered access. So then we turn to the idea of how best to communicate the message. And one idea that we really latched onto is this idea of storytelling, right? And it doesn't have to be a grand story. You know, you're not going to publish and rival Stephen King. It just needs to be something that resonated with you, right? And it can be to different audiences. Maybe your story is for a large room like this, or maybe your story is just something you tell to one other individual person. And the reason we like storytelling, the reason we think it is such an effective tool, is because it allows us to bury the lead. And perhaps everyone in this room has had the experience of trying to explain or get someone else on board open access and have found the response to be cold. And so by storytelling, by couching it in our experiences and how it affected us, we can avoid those kind of awkward situations. We can get right to how it benefited us, why we thought it was effective. We liken this to perhaps not a Trojan horse, but a Trojan unicorn, because it's nicer. And there's lots of advantages to this method, right? A lot of our communities, a lot of our research institutions have gone with OA mandates. And mandates are blunt tools, and they provoke negative feelings. But through storytelling, we can begin to counteract some of those negative feelings. We can focus more on the positive aspects of open access rather than the negative means by which maybe we've tried to achieve it. Not that they're negative, but, just comes across wrong sometimes. So perhaps a story helps communicate those benefits, right? Perhaps if you've published open access, you find that more journalists pick up your work and talk about it. It extends your reach to more people. Stories help communicate the benefits more clearly. They're tangible, not theoretical. And stories use the speaker's own language and message. And I think that's a really important part, is when we tell stories, we're not taking language and words that have been given to us from someone else. We're taking our own words and communicating them out. And that makes them ring truer, and it makes the impact greater. So who should be telling these stories? Well, everyone. All the stakeholders have a story to tell at some point in the process. And should we entrust individuals to tell their own story? Well, yes, absolutely. It's difficult to pollute a simple message, and we're trying to stick to a simple message. And a person communicates best in their own words about their own experiences. So we do have some recommendations to perhaps begin affecting this change. First, partnerships. Actually, first and last, partnerships, because we're running out of slides. Partners can create resources, right? We imagine a hub with guidance and messaging tools that are discoverable, easy to use, and perhaps most importantly, help individuals tell their own story. Not our story, but their story. So who are these partners? Well, they can be other OA organizations, scholarly societies, nonprofit organizations, publishers, funders, researchers, librarians, and more. Anyone who has an interest in getting the message out is a potential partner. And one last idea that we particularly liked and enjoyed was this idea of kind of an OA Nobel Prize. Something that really kind of moves people to do things sometimes is recognition. And so we thought that a prize or a ceremony that recognized elevated work that's been published OA would help motivate individuals to publish in that manner. So together, we can achieve more. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, but if I have like a deer in the headlight look, like I don't know how to answer, perhaps someone from my group will rescue me.
We got mics here.
I certainly agree with you that storytelling is a great tactic for being able to be able to move people's minds and actions. This could have been a talk about political advocacy, and it would have been the same outcome. So that's terrific. Something that's implicit in everything that you said, but I think deserves to be made explicit, is that as you said, change is hard for people, and that the critical element of moving people toward change is in providing incentives and letting them know that their work, their lives, their outlook will be better if this change is accomplished. So incentivization would be a key element.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why we kind of came up with that idea of what we called the OA Nobel Prize, right? Is, we sometimes talk about the prestige economy. And so one way that we think we can perhaps accelerate the adoption of OA is by finding ways to attach prestige to OA, right? And reward ceremonies, recognitions, elevating excellent work published OA, we think is a way to kind of create incentives.
It might be, I'm not a PR professional, but it might be worth considering investment in such assistance for structuring a message that is extremely compelling to a wide audience. As an example, the National Academy of Sciences recently commissioned some work on explaining why some economic models were important, and it seemed very dry at first when you start thinking about it. But if you Google, and I can't remember the name of the video series off the top of my head, but it was something about, if you just Google economic model and kidney exchange market, you'll get to an extremely moving 5-minute video about how an economist came up with a kidney exchange donation framework, which has led to thousands of saved lives, which you wouldn't necessarily think economic theory would lead to directly improving people's lives right away. But that's an example of a message that might be worth investing in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good idea. I was reading this morning about, science literature, and of course, a lot of the discussion recently has been around, people don't trust science or they don't understand science. How can we better communicate science? And I think what that gets back to is scientists, they communicate with each other first, and they communicate on the same bandwidth or wavelength, and then they just take their understanding and they reach out to others with the same message, and it doesn't land in the same way that it does among your colleagues. And so perhaps going to communications professionals, PR professionals, right, they can better tailor a message to a broader audience.
Good job. Okay. Good job, Barrett. Nice to represent us very well, so congratulations. I just wanted to follow up on the messaging. One thing that we discussed a lot in our group was that the message right now seems really large. I mean, it's polluted, but it's also a very large message. And we want to be clear that when we're talking about messaging, that it's reductionist, but it can not just in the message itself, but it can also be reductionist in the audience it targets. We've talked about this as nano engagement or micro engagement. So while it's important to engage to be able to tell a story broadly and a simple story broadly, it's equally important to tell a very simple story to individuals.
Well said.
Maybe we should also invite Ted, the TEDx and those kind of people. But I like the idea of storytelling. I was in this group for a little bit, and I remember later on after the meeting about because I worked with Peter Suber at Harvard, that the institutional repository had stories about open access. MIT has stories about open access. And so I'm wondering, do those stories resonate? I always remember Peter kind of beating his head against the table sometimes that, it seems like the storytelling is out there on the institutional repositories. So, how do we extend this message? One of the things I talked about in this this group too was the prospect of community and providing support to people in that message. So I feel like that's another thing that should be considered here too.
I'll say one thing since I have the mic. This is a brilliant take on it. I'm going to throw just a little bit of cold water on it. I'm a marketing person too. I come from a marketing background, so I appreciate exactly what you're saying here. But as some other people have expressed throughout the conference and throughout the year on the listserv, there are some legitimate concerns among researchers about whether this is what they need, what they have time for, whether it's good for their work. So I think there's a bridge that needs to be, a gap that needs to be bridged there to make sure that what is being sold is what they need. So if there are improvements in open access, we should also be cognizant of those and try to build the resources that they need to make it more possible for them to publish open, to make data open and so forth. Does that make sense? Am I?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree absolutely with that. I mean, if we're talking about communication, if we're talking about marketing something, it's always more challenging to market a product that somebody doesn't want or doesn't work for them. You know, trying to sell a vacuum cleaner to somebody that needs a mop is not as effective as selling them a mop. I mean, how that ties in maybe with this idea of communication with storytelling, I think of something that, you know, Stephen King once said, to be a good writer, you first have to read. And so perhaps to be a good communicator, you first have to listen, right? And so by listening to researchers and librarians and publishers and stakeholders and hearing their concerns, we can begin to also become better communicators.
And to speak, again, to add to Barrett's response, it's just, you know, I want to re-emphasize the thing at the very beginning is that a lot of times some of the gaps that need to be bridged are because of a fundamental misunderstanding of what's being sold. So the drilling it, all of this is premised on the message always starts with that simplest form. So if I'm trying to encourage you to do more open access, it doesn't mean I'm encouraging you to opt for a certain type of peer review espoused by some of the first open access journals or things like that. But that's usually what is happening. People presume you're telling them something even if you're not. So this all is premised on a kind of fundamental return to the simplest form of like an outcome for an artifact. And just to give a little bit more ideas about the kind of the Nobel Prize thing, what's the first thing that happens when people win the Nobel Prize? All the publishers make those papers open. So we were kind of thinking, not the equivalent of the Nobel Prize by any means, but we were kind of thinking about some of those things that a lot of researchers might not share a massive data set because they want to milk, 5 more publications from it, right? Which is a completely okay thing. I mean, we will understand why someone would want to do that. But there are people out there now that are kind of releasing the big data set right away, and therefore essentially possibly precluding themselves from further research and further impact. And I think it's really important to elevate that behavior and really reward that. So people the Center for Open Science has been quite instrumental in doing this, is to really reward some of the kind of the very open and kind of altruistic behaviors that some scientists are starting to espouse right now.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So it's 8:30 right now. I think, would you guys be okay doing a couple of stakeholder presentations right now? Or just let me know if you want to take a quick break at some point. It's still early. Maybe you need a refill on your coffee first. Everybody okay with the keep going? Okay. All right. Can we start with commercial publishers for their stakeholder report? Is that, you guys ready to go? And these reports don't have to be slide presentations. They don't have to be 5 minutes. But do your best. This is a new thing. I'm very interested in seeing how it turns out. So Wim is our first victim/volunteer.
So it was remarkably silent when you asked, could we start with commercial publishers? I would have expected some reaction to that, because it's really necessary to start our breakfast with commercial publishers. But thank you for giving us the opportunity to be first. For a format that is actually quite unclear and also, I think, very free still to fill in the way we want to fill it in ourselves. And as you know us, of course, we take the opportunity to do that. What I don't want to do is go through all the interests that publishers have again in this whole discussion, debate, development, whatever you want to call it. I think we all, you all know what our interests are and why we are stakeholder in this. And I'm happy to talk about it later in the Q&A. But I don't think it makes sense to now elaborate again on how good we are at open access and open science and what we all do. What I want to stress in this is more if we are a real stakeholder group and if we need stakeholder groups at all in this process, and what our thoughts are about how to move on with OSI 2017. But to be sure that we have a common understanding, if you look at this slide, you might already ask yourself, is this the commercial publishers? And I think there is the commercial and non-commercial publishers is already a divide in our industry that is in many cases not very relevant. We work very, very closely with Indawi, which is Paul's not there, so I can't say anything, which is basically a commercial open access publisher. We also work very, very closely with PLOS, which basically is a not-for-profit open access publisher. But we also work very closely with what some people call the traditional publishing industry, which I these days like to call the publishing industry that has traditional business models. There we also develop all kinds of standards and things for open access. So it's very difficult to define what exactly that stakeholder group would be. Actually, there's even smaller ones on the slide. Annual Reviews, which is only 2 or 3 journals, I think. A very small publisher, but still we have very intense discussions about where to go together because we are in the same business. So I also put University of California Press there. Totally different brand again compared to the big ones. And well, let's take also, for instance, IEEE, which is a society, which is a big publisher. So I want to stress that it's almost impossible to see us as one stakeholder group. What I also want to stress is that we are commercial entities, and maybe in that sense we're a little bit different, or many of us are commercial entities. And in that sense, we are a little bit different than most of the stakeholders in this effort, because we're simply not allowed, and also not willing, because of competitive reasons, to talk together too much about things. First of all, we cannot talk by law about competition things. Antitrust law would immediately kill that kind of discussions and bring us in trouble. Secondly, we don't want to talk about some things just because of competitive reasons. That is also, I think, fair to say that. We're not wanting to make our competitors smarter than we are ourselves. And once I realized myself that I didn't say where I work, well, I work with Springer Nature, so maybe that's good to tell the people that didn't know that. So, it's a very diverse group, but there's also many things that unite us. We work on very many standards together. We do a business that has a huge scale. There's millions of articles being published by these publishers, where there's a lot of standards and there's a lot of way that makes a system that basically works. What also makes it unique is that system is a real global system. And there is, if you publish a scientific paper in China, it will have the same, it will have the same metadata, the same way of reach as one in Northern England. So, and that is, sometimes we tend to forget that, but there is a huge infrastructure there just because of this large scale. What also is important is that we do work together on the new business models, and we do a lot of talking with our customers, of course. And I think it's important to state that we really ask ourselves, does OSI 2017 add anything to that process? These are some of the things that we are active in as an industry. It was very late last night when I made these slides, so I think I forgot 20 or 50 or 100 of them. But this is just a mismatch, and it's also to show that it's not just STM, our, let's say, traditional industry organization, but it's also OASPA, the Open Access Publishers Organization. It's not only, let's say, Crossref as the old infrastructure industry from the publishers. It's also things like RDA, Force 11, all these things we are involved in, and we discuss, and we talk with customers, and we talk with people in the industry. So I think it's important to see that we are really part of the infrastructure of scholarly publications. Just to show that we don't only want to talk about traditional things, we're very involved in the altmetrics discussion. I think most bigger publishers now already have altmetrics everywhere on their systems to show other metrics than just the impact factor. I think many of us are talking with, for instance, joining DORA, joining the San Francisco Declaration, to get away from the impact factor as the only metrics for research evaluation. We are extensively talking with bioRxiv, with arXiv, about preprints becoming more prominent in the scholarly information cycle. We just announced, as a couple of major publishers, that our references are now open through the Crossref API. So they're mineable, they can be used in discovery systems and that kind of things. We are working on sharing initiatives to make it easier for people to share their content across the globe, while we still have the model of a non-complete open access publishing. So to try to have these sharing principles now, where we try to make it possible for people to share their articles across the globe with peers, easier than it is now. Open peer review we're working on. Biomed Central, a Springer Nature company, 70 journals already have open peer review. And actually Elsevier announced a couple of weeks ago that all their journals will have open peer review within a couple of years. And I think these are major developments that we sometimes oversee, but that are happening within the traditional publishing industry. Of course, there's a lot of reproducibility and ethics discussions where we're very involved, because it's in our genuine interest together to get these things right. We also are very active in the whole data publication stuff, trying to figure out what standards we need to make it easier for researchers to, first of all, comply with funder rules about data deposit, but also to try to get a working data publication system that is easy to use for everybody. We have very important developments there, and the industry, and our industry is really part of that development. So, OSI20XX, what do we think as an industry? And again, this is not an industry statement. It is, I wrote it up yesterday night, but I think most of the publishers that are here will agree with this. But of course, there's a lot of publishers not here. And it's also not so that we have already decided how we want to move on with OSI. What we like about OSI is that it is a forum to engage with many stakeholders, and it's inclusive, and I think that's a very important part of it. There's no stakeholder being left out of the discussion. I think that's actually one of the biggest pros of OSI, that we are here together, and we're listening to each other, we're talking to each other, and we try to understand each other, which is always, I think, in my view, the beginning of working together. And by the way, with many of you, we work together already, of course. Yeah? So, as I showed in the previous slide, there's so many things where we already work together that you could ask yourself, does OSI add something to that process? Well, these two meetings, I think, have added something to the process, but I'm a little bit reluctant on understanding why 7 more of these meetings will add even more to that process. And I think there we have to be very clear on what the goals are that we want to reach with it. What I also very much like, and which is also unique for OSI, in my view, is the global intentions. There is at least global intentions, let's call it like that. And although I think, as you might have heard, I'm from Europe, I see this as a very US-oriented effort, which is in itself not bad, because there is a need in the US to be more together and more inclusive, trying to figure out where to go. But I think there's too little attention now in OSI for a global part of it. Not only the global south, also the world outside of that. But what really strikes me that if this is a global effort, there's nobody from China here, which is really, in our world, very, very strange. And I would also invite OSI to use our infrastructure there, because all publishers have offices all around the world with local people that are very involved in all the discussions in their countries. And maybe we could do there a joint effort to get more people involved in this. I think that is very important, because we can try to make recommendations and those kind of things here from the US, but I can promise you in China they at least will have the same process and trying to make their own rules. And I'm not so sure that they will be more or less, or that they will be less valuable than what we think here or in Europe. So we have to be aware that that is happening. Of course, there's also worries to finalize this with. As said, absence of important stakeholders in the discussion. Striking the funders, there's very little funders people, except for RCOK. Yeah, I don't want to hit someone. There, hi. Don't want to make people feel bad that did the effort of coming here, but there is very little attendance from funders, which I think, in our view, is one of the, that's Springer Nature view, not the industry's view, is one of the major influencers of this whole process. What also strikes us that there is no clear commitment for membership. There is apparently, if you get into the list, then you're a member. Well, for us as a commercial company, that is quite difficult to sell to my boss. There has to be a remit. There has to be something that you become a member of, and what the purpose is. And that is, I think we have to. If OSI is going to continue, I think that has to be clearer. There has to be a clear choice for what we want to reach here, and then on an individual level, not on a stakeholder level. That's also a little bit the next one. It's unclear what the value and reach of what we say here is. We say it here and we go home again and we evaluate next year, or is there really something happening in between? And is there a need for messages from OSI to the world on things in the discussion? I would still, to be honest, doubt that. There are so many people that have so many opinions, actions, those kind of things in the open access efforts, that the message has to be very clear to be heard at all, but also to be relevant for the discussions. And I have to say it, although there's a lot of effort from the one-man show Glenn does, the organization at best is unstable and not very mature yet. If you want to go on with the effort, I think you have to change that, because otherwise, well, one day you won't be there anymore, and the listservs will go on forever, talking about things without reaching anything. So that is this is based upon a discussion we had very quickly yesterday, so I take it for granted that some of our colleagues might not 100% agree, but I hope I gave a right summary of what we thought and what our thoughts are. In principle, by the way, I don't want to be I want to end positive. In principle, we're more than willing to keep on supporting it if it becomes more clear. Also in a financial matter, which we already do, as you might know. I want to have to said. Many of the publishers are sponsors of this meeting. Questions? Remarks? It would be very, very strange for me to be on a stage without one question.
Wim, I'll, no?
No, maybe something for next time also, technique.
Are these working? There we go.
Yeah.
As I'm walking back here, just to clarify about the funders, there are almost 400 people on the list, on the OSI list. I just did a quick count. 20 of them are funders, so they're represented, they're listening. I hear from them off list. Several of them intended to come, but due to their other commitments, they couldn't. So they're there and they're represented, but they're not all here at the meeting. So.
Okay.
Hi, Wim. Just want to follow up on your thoughts around commitment for membership. My understanding is people are on the list and there's a conference and we come together and we chat and there's an attempt to produce some recommendations. What were you thinking in terms of a commitment for membership?
Well, at least that it's clear what a membership means. Now, you know, what we don't understand is if there would be a recommendation from the OSI. First of all, where would it come from? Well, there's this discussion about the steering committee or whatever it is, etc. if you're a member, you can say, then you can be, it can be clear that as a member you kind of have influence on that decision, and then after you have had that influence, you're kind of committed to that recommendation. So, but at the moment, there's no clear commitment to be a member to anything, and we as companies, we are not willing to commit to a majority vote here. Why? That is impossible, first of all. But second, we also wouldn't like to do that. So it's if you do a membership based upon the coalition of the willing, and say, okay, but we don't do any recommendations. The only goal of this is to search for things where we agree enough to work together on trying to find solutions. Well, that's another way of defining your membership, which might be easier to start with, because there's no real commitment to anything that this organization takes as a decision. But we don't want OSI to commit to OSI as one of our spokespeople in the future development of open access, because therefore it's not strong enough and not well organized enough, and also not clear enough what the goals exactly are. Is that a
Yeah.
It was a long reply, but Richard, you were. Oh. Okay. Well, thank you. I hope it fit your goals, Glenn.
Just as a primer, some of the groups found that they were sort of, there were many different voices, and so it was hard to come up here and say this is what our group believes in, because the group is, as Wim was saying, it's a very, it's not a homogenous group. So, how about the open knowledge folks? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I hope your coffee is kicked in. I don't have a presentation. Just a short few notes on what we talked about within the Open Knowledge Group. The Open Knowledge Group really approached openness in two ways. And we were comprised of, again, a pretty heterogeneous group of folks. We had, non-profit society publishers, fledgling open access journals like the Idealists, Richard from academia, lots of different people literally at the table. But we all had commonalities in two ways. One is that we're all interested in opening knowledge for free. So free to publish, free to consume. And we've all got really different models for doing that. And we all agreed that there was no need for just one model. There was no one right model for doing that either. Many of us at the table were transitioning in a period of transition, trying new approaches to open access, maybe trying to move away from the APC model. So there was experimentation going there. But all of us were very concerned with financial sustainability. There are a lot of expensive parts within publishing, open access publishing, little p, just making content available. And one of the biggest expenses noted was actually the peer review process. So there was lots of experimentation happening around new ways to do peer review, means of automating peer review, and other such expensive pain points within the process. So that's one conception of open that we shared in common. The other is that we were all very concerned with getting content to the communities who would benefit the most from it. So we had representatives from the Wikimedia Foundation, for example, and folks who are interested in history communication. So a lot of the concerns actually that came up in the communication or culture of communication group were echoed at our table as well. Something else to note is that a lot of the conversations that we're having here today, that we've had at this conference, that the scientific community has been having for a really long time about how to make open access work and what models for publishing that are sustainable might look like. The humanities has actually been at the forefront of this, and I don't know if Cheryl's still here, but Cheryl Ball can tell you a little bit more about this. They've been working with alternative models for free publishing for a while now, and so we really should be doing things like we're doing here at OSI and talking across the aisle about how that works. The final thing I want to note before maybe talking a little bit about some procedural stuff is that we all, like everyone here, I think all the conversations that I've had at this conference, we're all really concerned with issues related to openness, right? So incentives, reproducibility, peer review, and so on. They inform so much of the conversation. You can't talk about open without talking about these. So we ended up spending a lot of time discussing those. The procedural things, some recommendations from our group to Glenn. We talked about two issues. One, getting more researchers at OSI. It was suggested that wherever we have events that we do more of what we did here at GW, bringing folks like Lorena Barba in, getting local researchers and giving them really good reason, AKA money, or some sort of support to come. Because the folks who we want to have in this conversation, the people who don't necessarily care about OA, but are, obviously affected by it, we need to get them to the table as well, right? And then the other idea for that was having a satellite OpenCon event, so we could get the advocates at the table as well. The other procedural issue was, it was suggested that perhaps these stakeholder meetings we don't come to it in an outcome-oriented way to make these presentations even. It might serve as a good replacement for the work group mix-ups. So everyone who's a stakeholder can kind of come together and report out about what was happening in the individual work groups and maybe talk through as a somewhat related group of folks about commonalities and reflections on the work group processes, but really serving as a clearinghouse for information. It was also noted that it would be really good to make it clear to folks involved with the stakeholder groups that, maybe part of that process is taking an hour out of the first stakeholder group meeting to talk about what each organization does and synthesizing what exactly we're doing that makes us, open knowledge organizations or commercial publishers or so on, because the lines are pretty fuzzy in some ways. If you look at somebody like PLOS, they could belong to so many groups. So that's it for our stakeholder group. Happy to take any questions or comments from other members of the group. All right, thank you very much.
Did it work? Hi, everybody. A quick thanks to Glenn, to UNESCO, to all the sponsors and conveners of this institute. My name is Mark Newton. I come here from Columbia University, and I'm representing the Research University Stakeholders Group here. Although many of the participants in our working group occupy positions in their home institutions' libraries, we were joined also by our active researcher colleagues, as well as from the viewpoints of the General Counsel's office. And it may not surprise you to hear that while we found much common cause in the exploration of the ways in which research universities may advance an open scholarship agenda, we also encountered a refreshing, spirited debate, challenging two easily accepted fundamental positions on the value of an approach to the development of the open exchange of new knowledge and the pursuit of higher goals attendant to the role of the academy in modern society. It's not, we discovered, always quite so simple as to recommend that institutions of higher education impress unilateral policies of intellectual property licensure for their open access repositories without rationalizing the tradition of scholar-managed copyright. And while we may agree to observe openness as a virtue, it's also a vulnerability. The data sets produced by our scholars may not be copyrightable, but they encode and express a near irreproducible intellectual intent, and they represent a life's work. And thus, one-size absolutist approaches to openness fail to capture the needs of our scholars working as best they can within a system of anachronisms, even if it is evolving slowly. And these are the intellects, without whom there would be very little intellectual product about which to debate. The work ahead will be very challenging. We'll need to think critically and creatively about the development of programs and platforms that explore open in ways that meet the needs of our scholars. Can we imagine and realize, for example, university-supported platforms for open data sharing that invite peers in as collaborators, rather than as competitors? Can we incorporate commercialization into our vision of open scholarship as one of a number of modes of dissemination, or will these forces forever be opposed to a pure vision of openness? The answer to these questions and more suggest a revisitation of the role of the research university as an environment for the support and fostering of new knowledge. Despite the increasingly risk-averse mechanisms impeding forward progress in an era of resource scarcity at the state and federal funding levels, the research university has an obligation to the benefit of society and to the public good at its core, regardless of how invisible or rarely expressed this appears in modern discourse. Real advancement requires support for the innovation and experimentation of our scholars, structures tolerant of failure and admitting of a new range of techniques and approaches. Anything short of this presents a threat to breakthrough science and research, breakthrough scholarship, and this concerns us all. Yet the systems developed to provide these supports emerged in a different era of scholarly communication as well. One might well ask, would it even be possible to instantiate the modern research library today, imagining it didn't already exist? And as we found this a properly sobering thought exercise, we also find within the question the wherewithal to resolve our recommendation for strategic investments in our research libraries and across our institutions, to innovate and experiment in modes of support and partnership with our scholars, to elevate their efforts and provide on-ramps to open that speak to the collective interest. The challenges of supporting open scholarship in the research university are many and involve numerous stakeholders. Research data infrastructure, digital scholarship support, information discovery and access, and the sustainability problems among them, all challenges that both necessitate and contribute to an increasingly open environment of knowledge generation and exchange. And in common, they share the fact that solutions will come from the many, many stakeholders that comprise our institutions, our scholars and our libraries, and our modes of research computing support, and our offices of sponsored projects, and our information technology and high-performance computing infrastructure. What is necessary is dialogue and a party to convene the stakeholders and conduct the debates, and then use these to expand into creative partnership at local and consortial levels. For each of our stakeholder groups, the mistake we risk is in presuming the necessity of radical transformation in the absence of deliberate dialogue. OSI provides us with one such venue to challenge preconceptions, and libraries and their programs of digital scholarship and scholarly communication support and outreach suggest a counterpart at the institutional level. Thanks.
Mark, can I ask a quick? Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
All right. I've heard from others offline about the pressures that research libraries are under at universities. And this might tie into the library presentation later, but you mentioned, very interesting, that thought exercise about would it be possible to establish a research library today, given the modern pressures for communication and such. Is there, from what you could tell in your group, is there conversation happening at research universities about reinventing the research library, or is that just sort of it doesn't look like we can do it because they're established, or are there deliberate conversations going on about how to create Research Library 2.0?
I think yes, certainly research libraries are attempting to grow and expand into new modes of support for scholarship. But in an environment of resource scarcity, this is very difficult to do, and the tendency appears to be to fall backward to risk-averse strategies for supporting scholarship. And so it's a careful balance, and its advancement is difficult unless it's deliberate. I don't know if my group wants to answer anything else to that question. Thank you.
Looks like the next on the list is the Skolcom experts. Rachel, are you presenting? Okay.
All right. My name is Rachel Sandberg. I'm the Scholarly Communication Officer at UC Berkeley, and our group was Scholarly Communication and Publishing Experts. Whoops. Which means that we are not actually, this is something everyone has been saying, is that we are not actually a stakeholder group. We are everyone in this room. And so the approach that we have taken to thinking about common goals and common problems and how we can work together, we looked at as a microcosm of what OSI is trying to do in its entirety. We obviously can't speak for everyone, but the idea is that we're represented by people from every stakeholder group, and we challenge the idea that there even is such a thing as a stakeholder group. This is something that commercial publishers were talking about earlier today, especially when you think about the culture of communication and the need to recognize individuals and the importance of individuals' perspectives and stories. It's really hard to be willing to put yourself in one particular group. But we did talk about some common goals, again, that we think are reflective of OSI as a whole. One of the goals that we discussed was just the need for a better understanding about what sharing and open access actually is, and perhaps the need for creation of a spectrum of what sharing and open access means. When a lot of people have talked about different data sharing needs versus final publication or traditional publication needs, and developing a more cohesive understanding of open access and perhaps a spectrum accommodating different needs for different types of digital objects. We also talked about the need for clarifying the message around open access and, like everyone has been saying, the need for better incentives to effectuate change, to be able to encourage and the identification of collaborators, promoting self-interest. How can we really hone in on what incentives will bring us to the outcome of open? Another interesting issue that came up as a common goal is the desire for perhaps a more balanced landscape for authors' rights. We talked about some power differentials in the current landscape for author rights, and that it's difficult for all of the different stakeholders in this room to participate in that conversation. Authors, there are some perspectives that authors already know what they need to know. Scholarly communication officers often have Juris Doctors and can advise about copyright. And the publishers have a view. And so leveling the power differential in the landscape for authors' rights is going to be important as we advance to OA. And one way to do that, and we're not necessarily advocating, we're not making recommendations here about particular steps forward, but one way to do that is to more routinely offer a spectrum of options for authors when they publish, and supporting that with education about what those options mean, so that perhaps it's not always a CC BY license that gets slapped on something. And at the same time, being cognizant of the fact that at some point, that output is no longer open, and perhaps that's when a no derivative license is attached to something. All of that obviously feeds back into the idea that we don't have a clear understanding of what open actually means and what it could mean if we think about it as a spectrum. The other thing that became really clear as we talked as a group is that we have very little understanding of what each stakeholder group can contribute to the conversation and the knowledge and experiences that other stakeholders have. And I actually think that that's one really incredible thing about OSI is that it's a learning opportunity for us to hear the perspectives of other, I'm so tired of using the word stakeholders because I just don't believe in it, but that we can hear from other individuals about their experiences and learn what they have to contribute to the conversation. Some common problems that we recognized. There are currently too many impediments to researchers and other stakeholders' participation in open access. And there's also this question of who can speak? Who has the authority to speak? Is it valid for a librarian to advise a researcher where to publish? It comes down to trust and respect for knowledge that we all have, and there's currently hesitation and a misunderstanding about what we all bring to the table. And one other problem being that because there's this misunderstanding about how we can all participate, it's hard to argue or lobby for an opportunity to participate in relevant decision making. Again, one other great thing about being here is that we're all at the table, but when we go back to our institutions or our companies, we feel like we're not necessarily invited to the conversation when decisions get made about how to move forward. So thinking about how to tackle that broadly. So what can we solve by working together? One recurring theme that we discussed was to establish better synergies. One example of what we mean by synergy is that repositories could work with publishers to get metadata that automatically feeds into the repository, or perhaps publishers could send repositories pre-formatted versions that comply with a university's open access policy. So that there are points there are relationships that we can better leverage that benefit both stakeholders, and that those occur at times other than just negotiating a license, that those synergies need to be established and leveraged throughout the scholarly publishing process. And like everyone else has been saying, we would love to work together to get better representation at OSI from research offices, higher level administration, researchers, and societies across disciplines. So here's what we are willing to do, being a very diverse group. These were the things that we came to. First, to address the problems that I just discussed, we are very motivated to facilitate stakeholder engagement across stakeholder groups. So this involves a commitment to really listening to and respecting the thoughts and ideas of everyone participating in scholarly publishing. And I take with great heart the notion from the commercial publishers that this meeting should promote outcomes, and it's perhaps not always clear what a membership commitment means and how we're working together to outcomes. But I do want to emphasize the importance of just the communication itself and the opportunity to meet and discuss, because we don't all always have the opportunity to do that with other people participating in the conversation. One thing we also would like to propose is possibly a fellows program, either with OpenCon or in some other capacity, to bring in new or young researchers, or early career researchers to participate. We would like to commit to establishing either a better understanding of what OA is, a better message about what it is, or an actual spectrum of OA that relates to the different research objects. And that we commit to being ambassadors to our own groups, with groups being defined obviously very loosely. Our group could be in a couple of librarians or a couple of researchers in our department, but that we commit to engaging and communicating and listening with our groups. That's it. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you,
sorry.
Rachel. I wonder, having been present at our gathering, I think it might be worthwhile if you just said a little bit more about what would be involved in the Fellows Programme, because I thought that was actually quite an interesting suggestion. And I think some people might find it interesting just to hear a little bit more about what was actually proposed.
Well, I mean, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about what was actually proposed.
As far as I can remember, Rachel,
Same.
The idea was that it would involve people from one stakeholder being offered the opportunity to spend some time, weeks, months even, in the environment of the other organisation. And that seemed to be like a very good idea. In other words, it would allow a funder or a librarian to spend some time in a publishing environment to actually see what forces do actually operate in this particular ecosystem. It would allow a publisher to spend some time with a research office or a library to see actually what actually happens. I think there's a tendency to stereotype and to generalize what other people do, and that there's a bit of an awareness gap between what we think about other stakeholders and what actually goes on and what value is added. And I think the idea of something like this certainly resonated with me. It wouldn't be trivial to set up, but it certainly seemed to me that, you know, we can come here and we can sort of spend 5 minutes saying this is what publishers do, this is what libraries do, this is what funders do, but that only scratches the surface. And I think that the idea of a Fellows Programme along those lines was something I thought was worth exploring.
Yeah, I actually, so my recollection was similar, that we discussed it as kind of a secondment, that you could get seconded to a different stakeholder for a period of time and then report back or produce some deliverable about that.
And we also talked about the possibility of looking at what others are doing in establishing fellows programs and working in collaboration with those other groups, and that it might also be an opportunity for a funding option for some people that would be venture people or something like that.
Yeah.
So. No.
All right. Thanks a lot. Oh.
Just to follow up, Richard, on your idea, would it be more feasible if, let's say, Rachel is she's at Berkeley, so what if somebody in the Berkeley library went to the publishing, to the press for a couple of weeks? It wouldn't have to be, you know, going overseas or cross country, but just within the same institution.
Yeah, it would certainly work well in any area where there are publishers just up and down the road. I mean, I could see it working well in Oxford, for example, as you have Wiley and Blackwell and OUP on the publishing sector, and an awful lot of other sectors there as well. I could see it working in London. I could see it working in a lot of places where geographically it would be quite convenient.
I do want to emphasize, though, and this is something Colleen touched on yesterday, that and that the commercial publishers were talking about today, is that, you know, there are very different funding models and market forces that shape publishing in the global south versus Europe versus here. And while we could do this low budget by sending someone down the road, I think that there's a lot to be gained by understanding better how things work in different regions.
Can I jump in with another? I don't see any other hands, so I'll keep you up there. You mentioned, Rachel, about the not being at the table when the decisions are made. Just to elaborate that on that just a little bit, one of the philosophies of OSI is to bring in as many decision makers as possible, the executive directors, the high-level people, so that they are in a position to help push change forward. And I know that you are, you and Jeff Mackey Mason at Berkeley are the movers and shakers at your institution for this. So hopefully that's not
yeah,
not an issue for you, but yeah.
No, I mean, and the one example of that is something like a research information management system, that if you were going to encourage the adoption of that to facilitate open access deposits and feed promotion and tenure and public-facing profiles, you know, how can the library participate, even if it doesn't have money to do that, in encouraging research offices to promote. It's that kind of, we're all engaged in the landscape of scholarly communication and scholarly publishing. We don't all have an opportunity to have money to participate, but we'd like to help in decision making because we have the expertise and an understanding of how all the pieces fit together.
And if I have one follow-up, please, since again I don't see any other hands that I'm hopefully not monopolizing here. The comment came up with the previous presentation. Oh, no, I'm sorry, the open knowledge. Who did the DART framework? Was that, okay. The idea of promoting or helping raise awareness anyway, that there's a spectrum of open, and the idea that this should be promoted and I'm just envisioning that there would be an awful lot of pushback. Mm-hmm. How do we address that if that's the strategy that we decide to? Because we don't want to create a culture war within.
Absolutely, and I think, and I obviously can't speak for the group, and since our group is evocative of the entire OSI also, but I think for me it comes back to the message that our working group, the culture of communication, was discussing, is that we focus on open as an outcome, that the very simple message and the end product is accessible and to be read. Within that, data may be published in various ways, and journal articles and monographs may be published in various ways, but so the spectrum doesn't have to be in the simple message, but that on the back end, authors are given choices, and that there's a framework to support a spectrum, even if the message itself about what open is very simple.
Would the journal editors like to say anything? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Technology.
Do we have a Mac adapter back there? Okay. Oh.
Let's see if this miraculously works. Nope. Let's go on a little trip. in Geneva, Switzerland. Okay, well, that wasn't too bad. All right, well, to reiterate what other people have said, our stakeholder group really represents a wide variety of backgrounds, very few of whom are journal editors. But nevertheless, we're representing journal editors in this context and really happy to be able to have the forum to talk about this some more. So our group, if everyone can stand up who's still here, Abel Packer, Kim Barrett, Patty Baskin unfortunately had to leave, Sue Murray, and myself. Thank you. So we've talked a lot about journals as if they're all with publishers with big deals or big APCs, but there are really a lot of editors who don't experience either of those situations, and so that's what we're going to be talking about a bit here. So these editors often have very small journals. They may be in the Global South, but there are plenty of journals that are very small that are not, that are also in the North. They're unpaid. They do this in their free time. They have, I guess all editors have some passion, hopefully, but they have a certain amount of passion to do this for free. They have minimal resources. They may have no publisher at all. They often have very little or no training, and we're trying to address those sorts of issues. The journals are often free or open access with no APCs, and the editors often play an informal role in mentoring authors and peer reviewers. Journal standards are very important, but their goal should not be to produce a journal that looks exactly like Nature. We need to support standards that can be accessed by editors in these sorts of situations. So a journal with research that's clearly reported and that can be reproduced is really the big goal, not one that looks slick and highly professional. Yes, that would be nice, but if that's going to prevent those journals from being able to participate, that's a problem. And we know that journal quality may decline over time in some cases, and it would be really helpful. You asked for examples of studies that we could do. It would be really interesting to find out why do journals decline, and what are those factors, and what can we do to prevent that from happening, and ideally intervene. Standards should be equitable and not beyond the reach of a journal simply because of cost, such as DOIs and clocks or other types of archiving. So it's important when standards are developed to think of ways that these journals can meet the standards. They want to meet the standards. They're often very aware of the standards, but can't come up with the money to pay. So for example, for DOIs, journals that work with publishers or other aggregators have an opportunity to negotiate with Crossref for a lower fee, but an individual journal can't necessarily go to Crossref and say, please give me a lower fee, I have no funds. But it would be really helpful if there were a way to do that, and same for clocks. Data sharing is an excellent goal, but if institutions lack the infrastructure to support it, there's little that journals or authors can do to do so. So there's a larger context that needs to be taken into account. Regarding journal indexing, this is one of the most common things that we hear from editors. Journals in the Global South are often invisible to researchers and readers in the North. While region-specific indexes can help highlight journals in these areas, indexes that claim to be international should include journals from the Global South, and they often don't because of some of the stereotypes that we talked about yesterday. Language access is another important issue. So scholarly communication should encompass multilingualism in its standards, procedures, and evaluation to reflect the research context and purpose and to target the intended audience, including the public. Journal articles should be available in the language where the research was conducted and for whom the research was intended. Translations for both researchers and the public should take into account cultural and idiosyncratic contexts. And in order to keep costs down, authors can be asked to provide these translations after peer review and revision. Editors don't just select articles. They also take part in the academic enterprise. So they help develop academic scholarship by working with authors, reviewers, and editorial boards. And institutions should encourage publication in their country's journals and provide academic recognition for the services that reviewers and editorial boards provide. However, as Susan mentioned yesterday, use of the impact factor harms Global South journals by discouraging authors from publishing in their own country's journals. Funding agencies and P&T committees should use other metrics, such as research impact, such as the MRC is doing in the UK, and altmetrics to encourage researchers to publish in their own country's journals. Mentors could play an important role, but ideally they need to be local. They need to take into account local practices and circumstances. However, specialty societies could pair up across the global divide and exchange ideas and resources, including editorial board members and reviewers, to expand both societies' awareness of each other's practices and issues around the world. The Global South has no author network, such as those available to researchers in the North. Such a network could help researchers on the same continent or even in the same country collaborate in a way that they can't do now. And just as a solution that works in Manhattan may not work in Mississippi, solutions should be developed with a local perspective. The top-down approach from north to south, oh, we'll come in and save you, just doesn't work. It's not something that's a welcome solution in the South and needs to be a local project. Stakeholders need to be involved, of course, and as Vince Cerf reminded us on Wednesday, local incentives need to be identified in order to change behaviors. Finally, the North can learn a lot from the South. Rather than expensive solutions that support publisher profit, not that there's anything wrong with that, but just saying, the lower expense solutions developed in the Global South may help us reduce the cost of publishing and make universal open access more feasible. For example, Cielo is developing an editing tool for authors to tag their own XML and generate a PDF, and AJOL and others support, evaluate, and index journals in a single solution. We can get to open faster together. Thank you. Any questions? That's easy, right? We can do that. Okay.
So apparently you have to sit at this table to ask a question. Thank you. I thought that was really great as a journal editor, and having spoken with y'all briefly yesterday, I found that...
Thank you for your input. We've had a lot of discussions. It's been fascinating. So I think this is great, personally.
Yeah. One tiny point of clarification as y'all are thinking about, I don't remember whether the stakeholders have to write something up for the report or not. Yes, okay. You had one bullet point about how institutions should value the service of editors it seemed like that was leaning towards TMP guideline kind of stuff. And so I just wanted to throw out that there are a lot of institutions that for journal editors in the humanities, they actually count editorialship as research. And it's a part of our research percentage. So just a note to consider that language so that it's not just all shoved off into the service work.
Yeah, that's great. I think, to clarify, I think in a lot of cases, the editors who are not paid are getting some academic credit for their work, but not necessarily the reviewers or the editorial board members. And to the extent that the editorial board members are actually doing work, which should be able to be demonstrated, they should be getting some academic credit for that, and that could help build that knowledge base. The issue is if all the peer reviewers and editorial boards of where the authors from those institutions are publishing are all in the North, then none of that knowledge and expertise and development of expertise stays in the area. It's all elsewhere. So it's important to have that milieu developed. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. So I wanted to point out that in the open intellectual property group, where our focus was on a lot of international collaboration, we thought that larger publishers could help smaller or under-resourced publishers help come up to standards technologically with targeted help, that it would improve not only the smaller publications, but it would help larger groups access that intellectual property or that material. And I think it's very interesting that agrees with what you're saying about helping different groups helping each other in the capacities that they can, all toward their own particular goals of open.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. It would be great if the journals in need could have a group to turn to say, here are some of our challenges. You know, would you be able to help? That would be great. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Let's do one more, and then we'll break again. Scholarly, what's the next one on the list? Is it libraries? Yeah, scholarly libraries? Okay.
It doesn't seem to be. I am. Try the other one. I feel like I should sing for everyone as I do this. Yeah. Yeah? Thank you. So good morning, everyone. How's everybody holding up? Good? Yeah. So my name is Megan Wacha. I'm the Scholarly Communications Librarian at the City University of New York, as well as a member of Wikimedia NYC, which supports libraries and other cultural heritage organizations in the New York metropolitan area. I have the great privilege of representing scholarly libraries and library groups. We are a large group which comes from institutions and organizations with different needs, different resources, and different missions. So like any other stakeholder group, we share a deep commitment to open, but we disagree about what path to take moving forward. And we disagree not only in how we support open at our institutions, but in the very definition of open itself. So really, any issue one could possibly disagree on, other than the support of open, we're there. So what we really wanted to do was to identify our shared interests. Where do we agree? And for us, ultimately, we support open access because we support the rights of those that create and use information. But at academic libraries, our faculty don't just operate within the information economy, but within the prestige economy as well. And as one of our participants pointed out, this has largely been outsourced to for-profit publishers. So how do we support faculty, their right to read and their right to be read, in a way that ensures the efficient and effective use of our library's budgets? And if you think about this, this is really core to the library's early involvement in open access, thanks to the serials crisis, but it's not an issue that we've fully addressed. So as a first step, it's important for us to define our interests, and so we've begun drafting a statement to do that as distinct from the interests of other stakeholder groups. And we've also started conversations about future actions. So there have already been a number of successful collaborations in place, perhaps most notably, the Coalition of Open Access Policy Institutions, or COPE, which has no barrier to entry other than your commitment to moving an open access policy forward. And so we have a range of recommended actions, both within and outside of libraries. These touch on outreach and advocacy issues, as well as larger questions about infrastructure. There's a lot of interest in improving discoverability of content once we've already made it open, so making sure that our repositories are optimized to be discoverable to Google Scholar and other indices, as well as an interest in creating portals for those repositories. So connecting the content on a number of issues, whether it's geographic location, subject area, or consortium. Overall, our stakeholder group really expressed a great need for transparency in what it costs to support open. So this includes the support of library-based publishing initiatives. So how much does it actually cost to effectively support an open access journal at our institution, different types of open access journals in different disciplines? What does it mean to effectively run an institutional repository? Which does require a great deal of labor and perhaps more than is being moved to it now. But also, what are the implications for an APC-based model? Especially, we really need more research about what this would mean for a broader range of institutions. And it's very important that we do this because if we move the paywall from the access to read point to the access to publish, who will be locked out as a result of that decision? At our institutions, we work with a broad range of stakeholders, so not just our full-time faculty, but adjunct faculty, faculty in the humanities who may not have the financial means to enter that mode of open. So, thank you. Are there any questions or any comments from my peers in the group?
Yeah, so I just have a question. Within the library group, was there a lot of debate or discussion about, things that are fully open, you're serving the world, but you also have a very specific, typically defined constituency that you also have to serve, which would be, your users, your faculty, your students. And was there any discussion about tension between those, or is that sort of well understood and not an issue within your communities? Sort of getting that balance.
It's a great question. I think it's one that we didn't dive too deeply into, and that's not because it's not an issue. We can't really, our researchers are a part of a larger information ecosystem, so they are working with people outside of our institutions, out in the world. And I think that, professionally, we have a deep commitment to providing access to the larger public. But that the constraints of our ability to do so are really going to be focused on the needs within our institutions.
Thanks.
Yeah?
I just wanted to respond further. I wasn't present at the group, though I was supposed to be. I joined a different group, but either one of those groups could have been my group, which seems to be a theme for today. I would also say that some of us work at public institutions, and there is a public service component to that. And so we aren't simply working at the behest of and in the interest of our faculty and our local constituents. We actually have an obligation to serve the taxpayers and the greater world. And I think that if we get too, I think that there's sometimes a risk that we corporatize what we're doing too much and we forget about that public service mission. And I just want to say that needs to fit into that. And increasingly, it seems important to emphasize that, and it's a way, in fact, to make a strong case or a different case for open access because there's a need, perhaps more, and there's a complacency that we could afford before that maybe we can't now.
Yeah. It's a great point. Thank you.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I'm just curious. Is the public service component, is the mission, is it defined by the legislature? Is it defined by you? I mean, where does it come from? I know it's pervasive in society, the move toward open, and everybody wants more open, but how do you see your mission as, where does the mandate come from?
Well, in the state of California, it comes from the legislature at some point because the legislature is the source of a lot of our funding. So there's that very tangible funding issue. But I think that higher education in general has, and has historically had a role to play, not just within its own environment in a kind of echo chamber, but in the larger cultural environment. And we talk a lot now about alternative facts, and we talk a lot about anxiety, about information circulation, or these kinds of echo chambers that happen in spaces where people can seal themselves off from a lot of information. And it seems that open access is very much a part of that conversation. Now, just because something's open doesn't mean that it is accessible in the sense of being understood. So there's also a translational necessity here, right? And anyone who's doing translational science or any kind of distillation of information for the public is also an important piece here. But then, of course, you need the research to be open for those people to be able to translate it, report on it, and have it visible to the larger culture.
The reason I'm needling you about this is that it seems like if this group is starting to think in terms of what sorts of concrete steps, what sorts of actions can it recommend, and I don't know exactly how we go from recommending it to doing it, but to be determined. But if the legislature in California, for example, has specified by statute that all research produced by public institutions in the state of California will be made open, does it delineate after that exactly what open means, or whether the data sets are included, or what it means for the researchers who might not want their research to be immediately open? And it falls into the category of the be careful what you wish for, or maybe it's the detail, devil's in the detail. Is it specified with that kind of clarity in California?
Let me clarify that. When I say that the legislature demands a certain attention to the public service mission, it's not in terms of an open access policy. The open access policy in California comes from the faculty. So there is AB 609 was an effort at the level of the legislature to make state-funded, explicitly state-funded research coming out of state. State research institutions and the grants that come from those available. And that was actually ultimately constrained to public health. And so the goal initially was to have something like a federal funding mandate, and we ended up with something that was very, very limited. And in fact, I'm not even sure it's being implemented. So that kind of state level thing doesn't go very far, or hasn't so far. It was subject to a lot of special interests, and it got really constrained. So I think that I'm making a logical leap here between the mandate for public service in general and the notion that open research speaks to that very directly.
Mm-hmm. And again, I don't want to dive too deeply into this, but it does seem that if this group was interested in finding a quick way to promote open, then maybe finding a way to approach legislatures without being a lobbying group or an advocacy group here, but just saying this is something that needs to be done, and here's how you would do it. Here's the legislation that would work to require that all the institutions within your state meet certain goals. Again, it's a fine line.
As long as you have some kind of funding that you give those institutions to make that happen too. Because I think that these unfunded mandates are very hard to deliver on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this has been a big question for us at CUNY. We also have a legislative mandated mission, but particularly to serve, to provide education and knowledge to the underserved populations of the city of New York. And we do not have an institutional open access policy in place. And so, you know, there have been a lot of questions about what is the right way forward around open access policies, and what are the implications for our researchers and their union, particularly around issues of academic freedom. Yeah. Great, thanks.
Let's break until 10:20, and then we'll continue with the scholarly societies at minimum, and then I know that the infrastructure groups wanted to present as well.
Good. No, is the AV guy back there? I can't see. Thank you. You guys, good morning. I want to give a shout out to Glenn for all the work he's done to bring us together and to help keep this going before I get started. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully there'll be more of that later too. As you've heard already, society publishers as a monolith doesn't really work. It doesn't work for commercial publishers, it doesn't work for libraries. Nevertheless, we did get together and have a conversation among a half dozen plus of us. There's only a handful of us still here hanging on. Michael's name is bolded because most of what I've got up here, he actually drafted and sent around by email. And full disclaimer, we had a nice chat, but we weren't really focused on generating a presentation. So this has happened afterwards, and we haven't formally got together to approve this as a document. So there's a little bit of me in here, there's a little bit of Carla, a lot of Michael. I started with a slide that says received wisdom, and this is sort of looking backwards rather than looking forwards, which is what we're supposed to do. But a couple of points, as commercial enterprises, even though we're nonprofit, we still need to have sustainable business models one way or another. And it's no secret, and indeed Vince Cerf mentioned this with respect to the ACM, for many society publishers, we use surplus revenues from the publications activities to drive the other good things that we do. In the grand scheme of things, that construct, is not transparent to many people, and maybe making it clear and obvious will help diminish some of the angst around it, and or B, is incompatible with a publishing mission. And if we're going to run meetings, if we're going to do education, if we're going to do outreach, if we're going to advocate on behalf of our practitioners, we need to fund those activities in other ways. And then in terms of a flip to gold OA or a move in that direction, I don't know if this is received wisdom or something that it would be worth investigating, but two possibilities. Possibility one is there's a sort of a race to the bottom in terms of saving as much money as possible and as a result diminishing quality of outputs. And or two, ASPB, the society that I work for, publishes 2 mainstream journals, and our capacity to establish economies of scale is limited. So there may be ways of fixing that, but as of right now, we stand to lose out to much larger publishers. So one thing we could try and figure out among ourselves is how this notion that there's enough money in the publishing system to engineer a global flip or a migration to gold OA, how does that actually happen? I think there's a lot of work that could and should be done to establish how that would work and how it would impact positively and or negatively various aspects of the scholarly communication system. And as I said, within the context of self-publishing societies whose scale range from dozens or hundreds of journals to just one, whether and how we can create some really useful economies through efficiency. here are a few of the things that we can or do as organizations that I think are pertinent here. We've talked a lot about researchers and how few there are in the OSI venue. But among other groups that are here, scholarly societies perhaps have the tightest connections with researchers in any given discipline, and are therefore venues for information sharing and education around topics like open. Perhaps more to the point, through editorial policies and other things that we might do, we have the capacity to advance agendas and even, over time, affect culture change within whatever discipline we're working in. At a slightly more granular level, we are developing capacities for understanding what scholars within our ecosystem are doing, both in traditional outputs like journal publishing, but also in the context of attending meetings, participating in the organization in various other ways. A previous group mentioned a Nobel Prize for open. I actually have been trying to persuade the people I work for years that as an organization, we ought to be developing an award within our discipline. I think a Nobel Prize across scholarship idea is a great one, but I think in addition, perhaps not instead, trying to do this at a discipline level is going to be useful and important in terms of raising the visibility of open behaviors within a scholarly milieu. I think over time, the kinds of things that here's just a couple. There's many other ways that organizations like us could diversify revenue streams, but by building robust scholarly communication networks and trying to capture online the kinds of things that professional societies have been doing in a physical world since inception is a really important venue to explore. And I think, too, while it may be, you think it's hard to change promotion and tenure, but I've been involved in conversations recently that are looking at training paradigms that are shifting markedly from the letters after somebody's name to a collection of micro-credentials and experiences that define somebody's capabilities and professional competencies in a way BS or PhD or MS really can't do. So there's money to be made there in terms of credentialing either training programs or educational activities that are happening elsewhere or in the context of developing our own ones. Last slide. This is a word that I've heard a lot the last 2.5 days. And I think it's not that there aren't other groups and stakeholders represented here that don't value trust and have trusting relationships with their own clients and customers. But I think organizations like ASBB and the other professional societies depend on this in terms of our value and engagement in the communities that we serve. But I think we can also leverage that, and that gets back to what I said earlier about the capacity to affect culture change. So that's all we had. Questions are welcome. There's one.
I don't know where the. Oh, they're both over here. Sorry. I'm hogging the mics.
I would really like some of the recommendations that you were making for scholarly societies, and this is not a question, it's a comment, it's a collaboration. I just got a team and I just received a Mellon grant, a small planning grant for trying to figure out whether building a consortium of small scholarly societies to help with some of that infrastructural, administrative, financial needs. That the smaller societies don't often have the ability to facilitate internally and in sustainable ways, so that if the consortium is able to take over some of those administrative functions, the societies themselves can focus on their scholarly output, including flipping their journals. So it might be an interesting conversation to have that relates to some of the outputs that your group was was discussing for how we might collaborate. Now, that grant is meant for the humanities and the humanistically oriented social sciences, but I could see that happening across the sciences as well.
No, and it was stated earlier that we all have lots to learn from each other, including STEM from humanities. So, yeah, I think I think it's a great idea, and I'd love to hear more about it. A short-term challenge is that for an organization like ASPB, we are going to continue to need to make money from subscriptions. So any kind of publishing platform that may have as an end goal an open literature, inside of it or underneath it, will, in transition, need to allow for the way that we're currently, making money and selling access to libraries.
Yeah, absolutely. And then trying to figure out, okay, is there a model that will allow the membership to change so that you don't have to have a subscription-based thing? But that's, down the road.
Yep, great. Anything else? Well, thanks again.
I'm Lars from the Director of Open Access Journals. I'm a newcomer here, and I happened to be in the stakeholder group for scholarly research and infrastructure groups. I don't know the origin of this group, but it might be a kind of a residual group, because I guess it will be difficult to find stakeholder groups and even work groups who has not discussed infrastructure. We have already today, in some of the presentations, heard about that. Wim, for instance, very rightly pointed out that publishers, be it commercial or non-commercial or traditional or open, has contributed a lot to infrastructure in various ways. And of course, the standards group is as well dealing with infrastructure issues, and Margaret from the journal editors group as well, related to infrastructure issues of various kinds. So we were a very small group. On the first day we were 3 attendees, and on the second day there were 2 of the 3 participating, and then a handful dropped in. I've not had the time to sort of share this presentation with the group, but it's written up a few hours ago, as you'll obviously see. Anyway, infrastructure is a strange animal. I think many of us have very different interpretations of that, but here's an official one. Basic physical and organizational structures and facilities, buildings, roads, power supplies needed for operation of a society or enterprise. In the context of open scholarly communication, examples are standardized communication protocols, data exchange formats, metadata standards, harvesting protocols, APIs, identifiers, DOIs, also IDs, organization IDs, funders IDs, and facilitating services. And this list is, of course, far from complete. In our discussions, I think there were agreement that infrastructures and standards, etc., are crucial for making open possible, and that the drivers for infrastructures and standards and identifiers and other pieces of infrastructure in scholarly communication have and still are originating from the North and the West, for obvious reasons. And that new bits and pieces of infrastructure still needs to be developed. An obvious example is things that can facilitate efficient handling and monitoring of APC payments. However, there are serious issues around this. The first one I will discuss a little bit is the global implementation and adoption of infrastructures. And the second is governance and sustainability of open infrastructures to support open. So insofar as we, OSI, aspires to be facilitating a global open scholarly communication system, we have to realize that much of the bits and pieces of infrastructure has been developed without sufficient consultation with the global community, and that this has serious implications for the implementation and adoption of infrastructures. And this in turn means that today we cannot really talk about a global, open, scholarly communication system, in existence at least. And there are serious barriers here: languages, geography, cultures, and so forth. Another important thing is governance and sustainability issues. As research transcends disciplines, geography, institutions, and stakeholders, the infrastructure that supports it needs to do the same. It should be stakeholder governed, and it should have transparent operations. Sustainability is a crucial issue as well. Sufficient resources have to be available to secure the global adoption of infrastructures. And if you want to look more into this, there is a very nice paper done by Jeffrey Bilder, Jennifer Lin, and Cameron Nayland, and you can find it there. Several of you already is aware of that piece of that paper. So a little bit about what OSI should or could do, and that's my own sort of suggestions. I think it's important to get an overview, a scan of the current bits and pieces, and evaluate their adoption on a global scale. One obvious example, and we have heard of that earlier today, is, for instance, the DOI. I think all of us think that this is a great thing, facilitates linkability and discoverability. Anyway, from my daily work with the DOAJ, I know that 30% of the open access journals has not implemented DOIs for various reasons. And this means that it's very difficult for the long tail of journals to come into the global flow, and that is not only a problem for those journals, it's a problem for us all because we miss access to important research from many regions and continents in the world. And OSI should as well engage with the owners of those bits and pieces and push for measures that can secure that global adoption. Because if infrastructures are not adopted on a global scale, we cannot really talk about a global open scholarly communication system. And the flow of research outputs on a global scale will continue to be broken. So that's basically what we have accomplished during those 2 days. You can see Wednesday it was Laurel Haag from ORCID, Joan Delanik sitting here, and myself. Of course, both Laurel and myself consider ourselves as providers of an infrastructure service. Then we had the mix yesterday, and there were 4 additional persons dropping in: Adrian Ho, Celeste Feather, Nancy Gwynn, and Williams Nagbu. So, yeah, and then we had our very small mini-meeting yesterday. Before I conclude this short presentation, I want to inform you about a thing happening in Europe and beyond a little bit, which might interest you. There's an organization called Knowledge Exchange. It's a collaboration between national authorities in Finland, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, and France. They are working on various issues to promote open access, open data, and open science. They've been working a lot with the issue of sustainability of services supporting open. And last year, a report came out. It's called Putting Down the Roots. It is a study to improve the extent that infrastructure and content services required to support open access and open in general can be sustained, can be there even in the future. And now the continuation of this work is now facilitated by Spark Europe. A coalition is underway where important organization has realized that they are depending on these services, and they agree in principle to fund them, meaning that these kind of services should not be dependent on grant funding. So we can see here the Australasian Open Access Support Group called the Coalition of Australian University Libraries, the EU Commission, the European Research Council, the European University Association, LIBA, which is the European equivalent of ARL, Science Europe, which is an organization for all the research councils in Europe, and Spark Europe. Those organizations has in principle, and some of them more than in principle, committed to funding those services, which means that they will approach their members and ask them to chip in money to secure the sustainability of those services. I think that is important input and inspiration for this discussion. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, William. Mike, please.
Thank you very much. I like the collection of resources and the enumeration of the various players that you've had here. But it's when you start talking about consensus and stakeholder governance and these sorts of things, it strikes me that the message that's come from many of the groups here is that we can't even really define what stakeholders are. So imagining stakeholder governance is, in the first place, challenging. And certainly it has not been the case that any sort of consensus was sought or achieved for many of the services that were built. It was more that someone saw a need and they went and built a thing, and then someone else built a thing and a third person did, and then they started talking about how those things might work together and if they should and what the benefits would be. So, I mean, I guess I just wanted to offer a sort of a counter argument to this more central planning idea and encourage people just to go in the other directions and let the thousand flowers bloom, and let's figure out how to connect the pieces once they're there.
I'm not sure I quite understood your question. It was a little bit difficult for me to hear, but the work that's going on here is trying to facilitate sustainable funding and in return to get some influence, governance issues related to the future operation and services provided by those infrastructures. Of course, it will be a different setup for the different bits and pieces of that infrastructure, but I think it's a fair claim that if those organizations are committing funding to sustain those infrastructures, there should be some kind of governance and other things that can secure some kind of control about the development of those infrastructures. I don't know whether that was an answer to your question.
Well, I think it was a little bit. I mean, the point, I think, is that you can spend time talking about governance, or you can spend time doing a thing, and a whole lot of time could be wasted deciding how to work together and not actually working. And that's the danger I would suggest in thinking too much about governance as opposed to just getting along with the business of whatever it is you initially set out to do.
But as I indicated, there will be different kinds of setup for the different kinds of bits and pieces. So, but take a look at what's going on and keep an eye on it. And it's definitely, I think, a relevant thing for OSI to look into.
Thank you. Yeah, and Lori actually had mentioned after the dust settles here, we should talk about how OSI and ORCID can collaborate. So I look forward to speaking. Thank you. Thank you. A round of applause for all the stakeholders this morning. That's hard work to put together those presentations in addition to your work group presentation. So thank you very much, everybody. This is the first time that we did this. It's fascinating to hear these. We have 8 fast pitches. Oh, wait, Joyce, yes. Oh, gosh, I'm sorry. Wait, we're not done. Do you need my, okay, let me get it out of your way. After Joyce speaks, about what?
Representatives. Oh,
right.
Duh.
I'm sorry, well, I should tell people why you're up here.
I can tell them.
Go ahead.
Hey, I'm up here. I'm Joyce, Joyce Ogburn. I'm one of the elected representatives from what was the summit, now sounds like it's advisory group. I guess maybe Glenn doesn't want us anymore because he keeps forgetting he needs me to report. Did any groups elect any or select anyone yesterday? So I may not recognize all the people who were on this group as of Wednesday. I have their names: Megan Waka, Carrie Calder, William Gunn, Scott Pluchak, and myself. Anyone else who needs to be recognized eventually? Oh, okay, all right, we'll pick you up. Oh yeah, you came later. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, Peter Berkery from the Association of American University Presses. I'm with the University Press and Library Publisher Stakeholder Group. And we didn't actually, our failure to present this morning was a sin of commission, not a sin of omission. Besides the fact that we didn't feel like we had anything terribly meaningful to say, our takeaway from the large group discussions at GW yesterday or maybe Wednesday was that it wasn't clear that we were going to continue with a process that required stakeholder groups to nominate representatives. So if in fact we are going to continue down that path, I don't know if we're the only stakeholder group who wasn't paying attention or not, but if we need to get a representative, we can, but we didn't at this point because we didn't know that it was clear we were supposed to.
Yeah.
It kind of did look like we were abandoning it.
Well, we were asked to meet the ones who had been selected, and so I was going to report on what we talked about, and maybe that's the point, then, to have some discussion.
Yeah, Joyce, if I could just
Sure.
interject. This isn't an official report. This is the fact that a couple folks did get together. I asked Joyce to give their high-level perspective on what they came away with. It's just an interesting opportunity, like an at-large group presentation. So.
Yeah, but I did at least want to find out if some other people had been selected. So when we sat down and talked, we looked at each other and say, how do I represent my group? Because we had several different communities there, some of whom feel that they could report for their group more than others could because of the different roles they had, commercial or non-commercial, educational. And these groups weren't all homogeneous in what they would do. So what are we doing when we represent? And when we talked about advisory, we got more comfortable with the role, and we started exploring what is it that we could advise on. So we wanted to make sure we had something that we could actually think we could do and accomplish. So some of the things we talked about was the OSI purpose, and so this might be a useful phrase for anyone who wants to use this: incubator of relationships, ideas, and solutions. So earlier presentation talked about what is the purpose of OSI, and I'll share this with you, Glenn, don't worry. And then what would the role of the advisory group potentially be? Identifying issues, principles, goals, partners, the location of the conferences, and that sort of thing. We knowing that some of those are much harder than others to accomplish. We talked quite a bit about communication and the effectiveness and purpose of communication in OSI. The website might have more information about OSI and the issues in progress and purpose of what it's doing. We talked a lot about the listserv. The phrase that came up was unending meeting with no agenda. So we need to find some other ways, maybe off the listserv but still publicly accessible or not, to talk about issues or build community conversations so that we don't have a free flow that people don't know how to enter into or get out of. They have some other place where they could talk and maybe make some decisions or good commentary. We might have some polls on issues too, things like that. So we have Basecamp, but there may be other platforms that work better for that. We also talked about some virtual discussions or mini virtual conferences, since not everyone can be here all the time, and maybe have a regular schedule of those so we can keep up with what's going on as well. We didn't talk about long-term other items we might help Glenn with, but those were the ones we came up with, so I just wanted to give you that. So we at least felt like we had an agenda right now to help Glenn, and then we can talk more about other groups and how they want to intersect with that, or whether we're going to continue. So you can ask me questions if you want, but Glenn might be the better person to come back up. Yeah, William. He was one of the people.
Yeah, so I'll just add one thing to that. The reason that we, well, the reason that I was there was to just kind of see what the feeling of other people were, and did it match my feeling that this wasn't really an appropriate body. And then also, we did, as you said, to redefine things that just specifically talk about, well, what is it that OSI is? And we did feel like there were a few things we could say around, like, technological advice about things OSI specifically itself can do, as opposed to talking about broader issues of scholarship in general. So that really tight, narrow scoping, I think, is what was, I guess, the main output of what we got together and talked about.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Hi, I would just add, Carrie Calder, Springer Nature. Part of what we wanted to do when we joined the discussion was to really work out what's the remit of the summit, and indeed, do we still need to have a summit, because we kind of talked about changing the scope has evolved, and actually the summit really wouldn't be approving policy or making decisions on behalf of the wider membership, in inverted commas. That being the case, what are we guiding on? And then actually what came out is, if it is conference location or some really OSI specific structural decisions, that group already exists already, because if I'm correct, there is actually some kind of advisory group already. And so it was wondering, well, how does that fit, and actually how is that group represented?
Right. Not yet. So the group last year formed after this meeting, and it was voluntary. So it excites me to no end to know that there are people here who are interested in helping think through these issues. So if it's the summit group that does that, that takes a baby step in the direction of it being a more representative.
But to clarify, I don't think the summit group right now is the summit group. And I think, as was raised, actually very much we came to say, what is the summit? We're very happy to kind of help have that conversation of, do we need a summit? But right now I don't think it definitely is representative of all stakeholders.
Let's continue that conversation after the conference. I think there's certainly time to continue that.
Yeah, we had a much richer, longer conversation than I was representing. I was trying to do something quick to give you a flavor of it. I appreciate the additional comments from my colleagues.